Fan Guangchang, we have Yao Mingda, who wrote his first description of this stuff in 1930. They have their own forms of criticism that no longer holding water today, so to speak, right? Some of them are too much in love with Buddhism. They don't see how it is affected by Confucianism, that the principles of cataloging Buddhist texts are the same as cataloging the Confucian classics, and that's what I do in chapter 1. Others, like Tan Shibao, he just for some reason hates Fei Changfang because Fei Changfang was so religious. He was like Eusebius, rewritten world history through the Christian eyes. So before Christianity, there was no civilization on this planet. Christianity started the history. We have the same guy, in essence, named Fei Changfang. But for a Chinese scholar, this is unacceptable. There is no value in that. So I rescued Fei Changfang and brought in this perspective. So little things like this, I think it's timely thing for us to do that. But I also want to promote Professor Zhang Wu's book, coming from Cambridge University Press, where there'll be even, yes, soon, right? We already have the copy editing. Yes. So sorry for promoting another publisher,
but
it's the time for the Chinese triptych. It really takes its place because it's unforgivable that it's not mentioned along with all other scriptural collections. Okay, I hope I did not go beyond 10 minutes.
No, you're fine. You're
okay.
perfect.
Buy the book, I'll sign it.
Yes. I'd like to say a special thanks to Tanya because Tanya's manuscript was submitted to us for copy editing after it passed peer review, and you should have undertaken all the revisions on January 31st, 2014. For books here, and that's because nobody slept. Yeah.
Yes.
So thank you very much. You were a wonderful author to work with. And now the next step would be the next introduction I'd like to make is the Cambria Sinophone World Series, which is headed by Dr. Victor Mair, who is ready to speak.
I'm getting ready.
Oh, okay. Yes.
Okay. Well, it's hard to describe the whirlwind experience of being the editor of the Cambria Sinophone World Series. I'll just say very briefly that Tony approached me a couple of years ago, maybe two and a half or 3 years ago, and said, I'm going to start this new series. Do you want to be the editor? And usually I don't let people call me. I don't like to talk on the phone.
That's true.
But Tanya knows. She tries often to call me, and I'm never available. But Tony was able to call me, and she asked me, can we have this series? Would you be the editor? And I thought about it for a couple of days, because I'd been observing Tony at the AAS for about 3 years. And first year I was very intrigued. She came out of nowhere. And then the second year, it started to blossom, Cambria Press, and I was very, very interested. Who is this? What's happening? And then she asked me to be the editor of this series. And I had watched her enough to know that she was very, very serious and very conscientious and had very high standards. So I said, yes, I'll be the editor. And then she said, you can get anybody on your board that you want to. And I asked really good people, and every single one of them said, yeah, I'll just name the board. Ann Huss, Chinese University of Hong Kong, Xiaofei Kang from George Washington University, Liu Jiannei from University of Maryland, Han Xiaoxi from University of Chicago, Tan Sin Sen from Baruch College, Shi Shumei from UCLA, and she's the person who invented the idea of Sinophone. She's on it. Jing Zhu from Yale, and Wang Dewei from David Wang from Harvard. So we've got this very powerful board, and the books just come in, and really great manuscripts. And Tony and her staff are so good at sending them out for reviews, peer review, and producing them. And I work with a lot of other presses, top presses, and I won't name them, but they're the top presses in America, and the academic presses. And Cambria is at their level or higher in terms of the standards, exactitude, and the kind of manuscripts that Cambria is attracting. So it's really a great pleasure. And so since 2011, when this series was launched, only 2011, we've already produced 9 titles. including Rethinking Chineseness, Transnational Sinophone Identities in the Nanyang Literary World by E.K. Tan, Confucian Prophet, Political Thought, and Dufu's Poetry by David Schneider, a study of two classics, A Cultural Critique of the Romance of the Three Kingdoms and the Water Margin by Liu Zaifu, a very famous Chinese literary critic, Gao Xingjian, the Nobel laureate, Aesthetics and Creation. We had a special event with him at the Modern MLA conference last year. The Classic of Changes in Cultural Context, A Textual Archaeology of the I Ching by Scott Davis. Gao Xingjian's and E.K. Tan's books have already earned high praise in journal reviews. Gao Xingjian's book was recommended for being beautifully produced, carefully edited, and highly engaging and readable. E.K. Tan's book was lauded because it is well written and researched and makes important contributions to Sinophone studies, Chinese studies, and Southeast Asian studies, as well as to scholarship on diaspora, comparative literature, and world literature. So all the books that are produced in this series have to go through very rigorous peer review, and they're getting good journal reviews. So I'm very, very pleased with the way this series is progressing. So now I'd like to introduce a new book that's coming out. I'll be introducing several new books that are coming out this year. And this is by the translator Ross King, who is sitting right next to me. The title of the book is Infected Korean Language, Purity versus Hybridity, From the Sinographic Cosmopolis to Japanese Colonialism to Global English. You can say it covers a huge amount of territory, but it's dealing with sinographic. And the reason I wanted it in my series is because it's dealing with the Sinosphere, which is the written form of Chinese language in the way it affected East Asia. So I thought it was a good book to have in the series. Mark Arlen Peterson of Brigham Young University has praised the book, stating that this is a wonderful work in an overlooked area. The scholarship is brilliant, innovative, and highly specialized. One must be well prepared in modern Korean, pre-modern Korean, and Chinese to undertake such a task. This is a real masterpiece. So I'd like to now introduce Ross King, who is Professor of Korean Studies and head of the Department of Asian Studies at the University of British Columbia, UBC, in Vancouver, Canada, to talk about this book and the genesis of the book.
Thank you very much. I'm a little embarrassed to be in this company because the book is about Korean, and the book is a Sinophone series, and I'm certain that many of my Korean, red-blooded, nationalist Korean colleagues are offended that this book has appeared in this series. But I can defend it for a number of reasons. First of all, I'm also embarrassed because it's actually not my work. I'm simply the translator, and my job has been to bring into English what I thought was a really important work, and then to write a critical introduction that contextualizes the book better for an Anglophone readership. And part of the problem here is that there's actually very little available in English, or in Korean for that matter, that treats it in a theoretically sophisticated way, the way that Korean has experienced what I would call linguistic modernity, moving away from a system where literary Sinitic was the main written language, and then vernacularizing into the 20th century with Korean as their main written language. There are literally only two really decent books worth reading. One by Lee and Ramsey, another by Lee Sang-ok, translated also with Bob Ramsey. These are very linguistic-y works, and there's very little in the way of cultural and social history of language and writing in Korea that's available in any language, and I include Korean here because Korean scholarship in South Korea is also very compartmentalized. So I wanted to bring into English this really exciting work about the politics of language and writing and the history of that politics, as well as a work that engages what I call, or what might be called, language ideology in Korea, and that was written at a time before the field of language ideology really even had congealed in English scholarship. And so it was really language and ideology avant la lettre by this particular author, Mr. Ko. One of the questions that Tony asked me to address was, how is this book different and important? So first of all, Mr. Ko, whose book I translated, is not a scholar. He's actually better known as a writer of fiction. And so he's a very accomplished writer in Korean, but he happened to do all of his PhD work as a PhD student at La Sorbonne in France in comparative historical linguistics, and so approaches the idea of language writing, language history, writing history, with a writer's sensibility, but also having a proper training in historical linguistics. So it's linguistically sophisticated, it's literarily polished, and then what I simply did was to add a critical introduction, which helped position this work, written in the late 1990s, within the scholarship in the last 10 to 15 years around issues of language ideology, linguistic modernity, the work of Lydia Liu, other questions of how languages like Japanese, modern Chinese, have then sort of gotten away from classical literary Sinitic. In terms of what's unusual in terms of discoveries in this book, I think that I would like to think that my introduction contextualizes it in a way that the author himself was not yet aware of. Namely, I mobilize a concept of what I call the sinographic cosmopolis, what Professor Mair has just referred to as the sinosphere. But in my mind, this particular cultural formation was defined first and foremost by the fact that they used the sinograph, Chinese characters, as their one and only mode of writing, and how this determined the way that linguistic modernity was experienced in China, Japan, Korea, and Vietnam. And so, and this comes out of my reading of Sheldon Pollock's work on what he calls the Sanskrit cosmopolis, and he has this wonderful book about Sanskrit, or the language of the gods in the world of men, where he makes just a few side comments about what he calls, maybe the sinosphere as well. But the point is that what he says about East Asia is actually woefully uninformed about language and writing in East Asia. And that's not to slam Professor Pollock at all, because he already covers a huge swath of territory and languages. He compares Latinitas with the Sanskrit cosmopolis and throws out all these really interesting questions about what it means to vernacularize, to become a vernacular culture in modernity, that I think have not yet been addressed in a comparative way in East Asia. So he throws out really interesting questions, but the sort of answers that he tentatively gives us for East Asia are all wrong. And so I thank him, Professor Pollock, for posing these questions and for, in essence, opening up a new field of comparative research on vernacularization and its origins in East Asia. And I think this book, without the author, Mr. Ko, without realizing it, had actually written a series of essays that were quite useful in starting to think about this question of vernacularization in East Asia. So then the final question that Tony had posed in her email, sort of prepping us for this session, was what about future research possibilities? And I would simply point out that I'm actually now in the middle of a big project looking at the history of language and writing in what I call the sinographic cosmopolis, as well. That involves also the history of linguistic thought, where I would like to think that what is essentially a peripheral part of the sinographic cosmopolis, namely Korea, which has also to this date in Anglophone academia not received much attention because it's really out of the way and also very difficult because you have to learn Japanese, you have to learn Korean, pre-modern Korean. You need to have some familiarity, more than a little, with China to do it. I think that Korea and knowledge of Korea's history in this respect is really important, and therefore Mr. Ko's book was at the very top of my list of things that needed to be translated, and my introduction is meant to contextualize that for the Anglophone readership.